As America's global posture shifted and the nation began projecting strength abroad, something equally powerful was happening at home. But this time, the change was not occurring in boardrooms, in Washington offices, or on the floors of international summits. It was happening in the everyday lives of ordinary Americans, quietly at first, subtly in some places, dramatically in others, but unmistakably the American middle class, once described as shrinking, struggling, and disappearing, began to show signs of life. For years leading up to Donald Trump's first term, American workers had been told a painful narrative that manufacturing was gone forever, that globalization was unavoidable, that automation would reduce job opportunities, and that the best the average person could hope for was to adapt to the new economy, even if that meant taking jobs with lower pay or less stability. Yet by the time Trump entered office, many Americans had grown tired of that message. They did not want to be told that decline was permanent. They wanted proof that growth was possible again. And in the years that followed, the proof began to appear. The early signs were small, an uptick in factory hiring here, new construction project there. But piece by piece, the labor market started to shift. Wages began inching upward, then rising more quickly. Companies, buoyed by tax cuts and increasing business confidence, found themselves competing for workers instead of the other way around. The dynamic reversed. For the first time in a long time, workers had leverage again. It was a subtle psychological shift, but a profound one. Job postings increased, opportunities multiplied. People who had once felt stuck suddenly felt mobile. And when people feel mobile, they walk into their boss's office, not with fear, but with options. It was this newfound sense of bargaining power that triggered one of the most surprising trends of the era: Americans quitting their jobs voluntarily at record levels. This wasn't a sign of dissatisfaction. It was a sign of confidence. Economists call it the quit rate. And for decades it had remained relatively low, reflecting a cautious workforce afraid of unemployment. But during Trump's early years, the quit rate climbed steadily, an unmistakable indicator that people felt secure enough to leave a job and trust that something better was waiting for them. For many families, this was more than an economic statistic. It was a psychological awakening. It was the first time in years that they felt in control of their own destiny. This change could be felt across industries, but nowhere was it more visible than in manufacturing. The sector, long dismissed as dying, began to show real signs of life. Machine shops rehired, auto plants expanded, steel mills restarted dormant lines. What had once been written off by policymakers as a relic of the past suddenly seemed vibrant again. Critics argued that this revival would be short-lived, but to the workers stepping into newly restored jobs, that didn't matter. What mattered was that opportunity had returned, even if just for now. And opportunity did not stop at manufacturing. Retail, logistics, construction, hospitality, technology, almost every sector saw job openings grow and competition intensify. Employers offered bonuses, higher wages, training programs, and improved benefits in hopes of attracting and retaining workers. Paychecks grew, savings accounts grew, and in a country where financial stress had become a quiet epidemic, this lift in income helped millions breathe a little easier. The results showed up in data, yes, but they also showed up in day-to-day American life. In a diner in Ohio, a waitress who had worked double shifts for years suddenly found she could pick up fewer hours without losing income. In Texas, a father who had worked 3 jobs finally felt comfortable quitting one and spending evenings with his children. In North Carolina, a factory worker who had given up on promotions suddenly found a path upward because new supervisors were needed to manage newly hired teams. In Arizona, a young couple felt confident enough to buy their first home because both of their jobs seemed secure and wages stable. These stories unfolded quietly across America, not in headlines but in conversations around kitchen tables, in phone calls between family members, in late-night discussions between husbands and wives who dared to plan a future that once felt uncertain. At the same time, poverty numbers began to shift. For years, the poverty rate had hovered above levels many economists found alarming. But during Trump's first term, poverty fell to a 17-year low. Millions left government assistance programs not because of restrictions, but because they no longer needed them. They had jobs, real jobs, stable jobs, jobs that gave them more than just income. They gave dignity, purpose, independence. Food stamp enrollment dropped by millions. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened consistently enough that analysts began questioning whether America was experiencing something it had not seen in decades, a genuine rise in working-class economic stability. Another milestone emerged quietly but powerfully. Median household income reached its highest level ever recorded. This was more than an economic data point. It was the culmination of years of frustration finally giving way to upward mobility. For families who had endured wage stagnation since the early 2000s, seeing their income rise significantly and measurably felt like a long-awaited return to the promise of hard work. But rising incomes were only one part of the story. Debt stabilized, savings improved, consumer confidence soared, home ownership rose, and as people felt better about their financial position, they spent more. This fueled business expansion, which fueled hiring, which fueled wage growth, a cycle that, at least temporarily, placed the U.S. economy in a position of extraordinary momentum. Meanwhile, an industry that had long been discussed in political circles but rarely transformed was beginning to evolve. The American energy sector. For decades, foreign oil dependence had shaped U.S. foreign policy, national security, and public debate. Energy independence had been described as an aspiration, something politicians promised but never delivered. But under Trump's policies, expanded drilling, loosened federal restrictions, accelerated infrastructure approvals, and an explosion in natural gas production led to a remarkable milestone. For the first time in more than 60 years, the United States became a net producer of energy. This was not merely an economic achievement, it was a geopolitical shift. Energy independence meant the U.S. had more control over its own economy, less vulnerability to global price fluctuations, and greater leverage in international negotiations. It also carried a psychological weight. It made Americans feel secure, strong, capable. It signaled that industries long associated with American identity, oil, gas, pipelines, still had a place in the modern world. But perhaps the most profound change during this period was something intangible, something no chart or statistic could fully capture. It was a shift in national mood. For years, conversation had been dominated by skepticism, doubt, a sense that America's best days were behind it. But as jobs increased, wages rose, factories reopened, poverty fell, and global influence strengthened, the tone of daily life began to change. People spoke differently, they acted differently, they planned differently. The pessimism that had settled over many communities after the 2008 crisis began to lift. Hope, real, practical, grounded hope, returned. You could hear it in coffee shops, where workers talked confidently about switching jobs. You could see it in suburban neighborhoods where families took on home projects with renewed optimism. You could feel it in downtown streets that had once been quiet but were now bustling again. Even in schools, teachers noticed parents becoming more involved, more optimistic about their children's future. Churches, community centers, and neighborhood associations reported higher engagement. It was as if the country had exhaled for the first time in a long time. Whether one credited Donald Trump entirely, partially, or not at all depended on political perspective. But even critics acknowledged the results. Something meaningful had occurred, something that had reshaped the trajectory of millions of families. The American engine, the great machine of workers, factories, small businesses, and middle-class households, had roared back to life. And that momentum created a sense of national confidence that would soon collide with forces no one could have predicted, forces that would test the resilience of this resurgence, forces that would challenge the country's sense of progress, because every period of growth eventually meets resistance. Every rise faces a reckoning, and America's would come sooner than anyone expected. But first, before the storm, there was one more chapter in the story of revival, one more burst of strength, one more year of acceleratio, a year when America felt powerful, wealthy, confident, and ready for the future. A moment of national high tide, and that is where Part 5 begins.